Justin Trudeau acted illegally in invoking the Emergency Act during the trucker protest in Canada. That's now been legally determined. So, will this be a victory for free speech, or will it lead to the doubling down of authoritarianism by apparently liberal governments? Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom. Remember, if you become a supporter of our work, we make additional videos every week, like one on the farming protest that's very like the Canadian trucker story, as a matter of fact, and you'll see how it all connected to January 6th, and you'll see how liberalism is using the idea of the far right to introduce more authoritarianism, apparently to protect people. We also did an exclusive video on an 8% increase in child deaths. We give you the kind of content that's difficult to bring you publicly, and it's so vital that you support our work if you can, because as you know, we are facing a tyrannical and authoritarian force that wants to censor and shut down. In fact, when I'm reading about some of this stuff, I think about the demonetization on YouTube, and I think about the government getting involved in our work, and I think about how the legacy media have operated recently regarding me personally. And it's very important that if you can, you support our work, because there's no doubt we are sliding towards authoritarianism under the guise of liberalism, and the Emergency Act and the attempt to evoke it by Justin Trudeau was one of those moments that revealed that neoliberalism and its sort of mask of cultural progressiveness is an interesting force in contemporary politics. Remember, people had their bank accounts frozen. People went to jail. We were told that it was a national emergency. Canada has never evoked this act in its history. So it was an unprecedented act with unprecedented consequences. All the while we were told that the truckers were racist, that they were Nazis. Remember, this kind of rhetoric is becoming extremely common. January 6th was an insurrection. The farmers' protests are somehow far right and racist. It's almost as if you attempt to resist globalism, which amounts to the advance of the agenda of a global elite attempting to control the world's resources and the world's democracies, if you oppose that, you will be called far right. Fortunately, in Canada, a ruling has found that Trudeau's government acted illegally. Let's have a look at this story and see what it means for all of us.
Ottawa's weeks-long gridlock warranted the government's attention, according to the federal court. But using the Emergencies Act to deal with it was not justified. Justice Richard Mosley ruled that the federal government violated 2 sections of the charter. Freezing bank accounts was an unreasonable search and seizure, and the nationwide order to stop protesting violated the right to free expression. One key factor, Ontario and Alberta had already shut down border protests, demonstrating it could be done.
These are things that you might have felt at the time when you heard bank accounts being frozen. Surely these protests are freedom of expression. Thankfully, Canada has a form of constitution in which those values and ideas are enshrined. The bigger question is, would people ever attempt to exert this level of control again? And are the legacy media going to be made accountable for supporting the claim that these truckers were racist and far right and that their protests were not legitimate?
This ruling had a different conclusion than the head of the Public Commission found last year. Unlike his findings, the federal court ruling is legally binding.
Remember, since this, Canada has passed a new online safety bill that gives them incredible control over the media. And of course, they said this was to amplify Canadian voices and to support diversity, all valuable and important ideas. But one can't help but wonder if all of these online safety bills, we have one in our country, you've got them coming to your country, they're discussing them for the whole EU, are ultimately about controlling information so that trucker movements can't ever happen again. So that events where people protest against government activity, state corporatism, globalist corruption, can't ever be discussed or organised. You have to ask yourself in your own heart, do you think that these regulatory bodies, the state and the way that they are sponsored and their globalist affiliations care about you and your freedom, or do they have other goals?
Saying, I have concluded that the decision to issue the proclamation, that would be the invoking of the Emergencies Act, does not bear the hallmarks of reasonableness, justification, transparency, and intelligibility.
That means it was stupid, unreasonable, and not transparent, which is how it seemed at the time. I mean, what are they going to do next? Applaud a Nazi in Parliament?
And was not justified in relation to the relevant factual and legal constraints that were required to be taken into consideration. And he talks as well about some of the financial penalties they brought in terms of seizing and freezing bank accounts, because that affected people beyond just the people they were trying to affect. That itself was an overstep.
One theme, whether it's in the United States of America and the anti-MAGA rhetoric continually in the media, the condemnation of agricultural movements, or indeed the story we were discussing discussing now the trucker movement, what becomes clear is there is a disdain at the level of media for ordinary working people. And there is an ongoing effort and appetite to leverage ideas that legitimize the condemnation of ordinary working people. They're racist, they're disgusting, they're stupid, they shouldn't have rights. That Emergency Act was literally, we don't care about their rights, we should be able to bypass their rights, when in fact what they were doing was protesting quite unreasonable government activity that looks more and more unreasonable the more we learn about vaccine efficacy, the more we learn about the efficacy of lockdown, the more we learn about the financial relationships between the state and pharmaceutical organisations, the more we learn about the laws and indemnity that was granted to these organisations. The truckers, it seems, were right, the media were wrong, the government were wrong. Without the scrutiny of independent media, these kind of stories would just sort of fizzle out. Without the ability to use social media to organise, the truckers would not have been able to mount that protest. Without the independent media and social media, knowledge of the frozen bank accounts would not have risen to the point where enough people were disgusted and aware that even if they sort of like politicians like Justin Trudeau and their cute socks and their lovely hair and their love of dressing up, shall we call it,
I deeply, deeply regret.
it seems that there are questions to be asked of governments that have the aesthetic of liberalism, kindness, compassion, progressivism, but the actions of authoritarianism. This is a defining story of our time.
What's interesting as well in part of his judgment is he talks about how if he had been at the table, making the decisions, that he does recognize that hindsight is 2020, and that in the moment, he may have even been persuaded that this was necessary.
Seems like that judge is trying to offer as much mitigation as possible. Anyone could make the mistake of freezing bank accounts and throwing pastors into jail and all of that. I might have even done it myself. But the fact is, when you actually look at what's written down in our charter, it was illegal, presumably so as not to have masses of people over Canada right now going, wait a minute, we were protesting, we were within our rights to protest, and they froze our bank accounts, threw people in jail, evoking an emergency act, and we're not getting sufficient recompense. What now? What should happen as a result of this? Do the people get their bank accounts unfrozen? Are they compensated in some way? What about the people that have done jail time as a result of those measures? And what about Trudeau himself? Is he allowed to continue to govern, given he's a person who reaches for an emergency act with the enthusiasm he reaches for the shoe polish on party night?
But then